My name is Tahlia Grant. I am 42 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States military, and I have spent more than 2 decades serving in places most people only see on the news. I speak 10 languages fluently, and for years, I believe that knowing how to listen and to speak could save more lives than pulling a trigger. I have stood in shadows, negotiated in whispers, and survived because I understood the weight of words. None of that mattered to my younger brother, Mason. On that cold December afternoon, I stepped into his martial arts dojo, a place filled with the sharp smell of sweat and the dull shine of worn wooden floors. The moment I entered, the sound of sneakers squeaking and half-suppressed laughter rolled through the air. Mason stood there in his black belt, flanked by his 2 friends, also black belts, their confidence radiating like heat from a furnace. "Languages are useless, sis," Mason laughed, his voice echoing against the walls. He tilted his head toward his friends, looking for validation, and they both grinned. One of them, a tall man with a black belt in karate, stepped forward. His voice dripped with mockery as he spoke in broken Mandarin. "这是咏春，你明白吗? This is Wing Chun. Do you even understand?" I smiled, slow and calm, feeling a ripple of memories from years spent far from home. I straightened my shoulders and replied in flawless Mandarin, each tone sharp as a blade. 我不仅明白，我在这里就是为了教你真正的咏春。一招就够了。I do not just understand. I am here to teach you real Wing Chun. One move will be enough. Their laughter wavered. My words seemed to hang in the air like a quiet challenge. The karate black belt lunged first, confident in the strength of his youth. I shifted my weight, pivoted my hip, and let his energy flow past me. My hand pressed against his shoulder with precise timing, redirecting his momentum. In a single controlled motion, I swept him off balance and sent him sprawling onto the mat. No pain, no brutality, just the crushing silence of public humiliation. He hit the floor with a hollow thud that seemed to stop the entire dojo. Mason's laughter froze in his throat. His friend's eyes widened as he scrambled up, confused at how easily he had fallen. I remained still, my breathing calm, my hands relaxed at my sides. For a heartbeat, all I could hear was the sound of my own controlled inhale and the echo of their disbelief. Somewhere in that silence, a part of me stirred, the soldier who had spent decades holding herself back. The moment had passed, but the question lingered in the room like smoke. Who is she, really? I stood quietly, letting the moment settle. Mason and his remaining friends stared at me as if they were seeing me for the first time. Their bravado cracked, replaced by the nervous shifting of their feet and the subtle drop in their shoulders. Inside my own head, the familiar voice of discipline spoke. They had no idea who I truly was. They didn't know why I studied languages when others thought fists and guns were enough. They didn't know that every syllable I learned had been sharpened into a survival tool, long before I ever set foot in this dojo. I remember another night, years ago, in a forgotten industrial alley in Asia. I was kneeling behind a shipping crate, headset pressed to my ear, while the lives of 3 hostages balanced on the edge of my voice. The local gang leader would not speak English. My commanding officer could only wait. It was me, my Mandarin, and the soft weight of the words I chose. I took a slow breath and spoke. 放他们走，这是你唯一的机会. Let them go. This is your only chance. The memory flickered through my mind as I stood in Mason's dojo, the smell of polished wood and sweat grounding me in the present. The slow, steady breathing I had learned to control in those moments now carried me through this one. I watched my brother's face shift from confusion to something darker. Embarrassment. He had wanted to show off in front of his friends. He had wanted to turn me into a joke. The second black belt adjusted his stance, but I could see the hesitation in his eyes. He had seen his friend fall in one move and could not explain it. He licked his lips and tried to recover his confidence. I let the silence stretch, long enough for him to question every decision that had led him here. I felt the rhythm of the moment, the rise and fall of tension, like the pulse of a drum. In my chest, that familiar slow breathing, the motif of my life, kept me grounded. I thought of all the times I had been underestimated, dismissed as the quiet one, or the girl with the books. They didn't know that silence had teeth. I took a small step forward, my feet whispering against the mat. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just looked into his eyes and said in English, measured and clear, I wasn't just learning languages. The words seemed to freeze the air around us. He hesitated, then took a cautious step forward. My mind shifted into that old, familiar space, where movement slowed and every motion was a decision. My right foot pivoted, my body turned, and I felt the subtle tremor of his balance falter as if gravity itself was on my side. He caught himself before falling, but he knew. He knew that if I wanted him on the ground, he would already be there. I didn't need to strike again. The lesson had already begun. In the quiet of that frozen dojo, I could almost hear the echo of the past, the low voices in dark rooms, the creak of old floors under careful steps, and the soft click of distant locks opening when someone finally decided to listen to me. My breathing slowed, my heart was steady, and as the weight of that silence filled the room, I realized I had already claimed control. Not just of the fight, but of the story they would remember for the rest of their lives. The moment I stepped off the cold winter sidewalk and into Mason's dojo, I knew something was off. He had called me 2 days earlier, his voice unnaturally cheerful, inviting me to come watch a real black belt class. My brother had never asked me to visit his world before. Growing up, he kept his life of tournaments and trophies separate from mine. I lived in barracks and briefing rooms. He lived in gyms and local competitions. But his tone on the phone that day carried a sharp edge, like there was more to the invitation than he was saying. As I walked across the polished wooden floor, the smell of sweat and disinfectant reached me before his smile did. He waved from the center of the mat, his 2 friends flanking him like bodyguards. His grin was wide, but wrong. It wasn't the kind of smile you give to family. It was the grin of someone setting a trap, someone who wanted an audience for whatever was coming next. I had spent years reading the subtlest cues in the eyes of strangers across negotiation tables and in dark alleys. My brother wasn't subtle at all. His posture leaned forward, his eyes sharp with a challenge he probably thought he was hiding. I gave him a nod, calm and neutral, the same way I might acknowledge a potentially hostile contact in a foreign city. "Glad you came, sis," Mason said. His voice bounced across the room, too loud, like he wanted the handful of other students to notice. "I wanted you to see what a real martial arts class looks like, not whatever you do with your books and languages." The words slid off my back like rain on glass. I had heard worse from soldiers, from captains under pressure, from enemies trying to break me in ways bullets couldn't. But hearing it from Mason, my own brother, carried a quieter weight. It was the weight of a pattern that had started years ago, a slow erosion of trust that had carved a canyon between us. I remember the exact day that canyon opened. It was in a courthouse 5 years ago, under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. My father sat on the other side of the room, flanked by his lawyer, his hand resting on a folder of property deeds. He had taken my share of the family estate and sold it without a word to me. When I confronted him, he didn't deny it. He said it was his right, that I had chosen the military over the family, and that I would not know what to do with land or legacy anyway. I fought him, not with fists or shouting, but with the law. I gathered every document, every signed agreement, and I built my case brick by brick. Months of hearings followed, and in the end, the court ordered him to return my share. I walked out of that building victorious on paper, but hollow inside. I won with the law, but I lost a family. Mason stopped calling me after that. He stayed with our father, absorbed his version of the story, and somewhere along the way, his admiration for me curdled into resentment. When he earned his black belt, he didn't tell me. I found out through a tagged photo on social media. He stood next to Dad, both smiling like nothing had ever fractured between us. Now, standing in his dojo, I could feel the weight of all those years pressing down. I could see it in his eyes. He didn't invite me here to reconnect. He invited me here to prove something, to him, to the others, maybe even to our father. I kept my breathing slow and steady, a habit drilled into me by years of Wing Chun practice and missions that demanded absolute control over fear, anger, and pride. I watched Mason shift his weight, crossing his arms in a posture that screamed challenge. He didn't want a sister today. He wanted a target. I gave him a small nod and spoke in a tone as calm as the surface of still water. "All right, Mason, show me what you wanted me to see." The words were soft, but in my head, the echo of that courthouse whispered back to me. I had already lived through a betrayal that carved my world in half. This was only the shadow of that same old wound, dressed in a black belt and a crooked grin. And deep down, I knew he had no idea what he had just started. Mason paced across the dojo floor like he owned the room. His black belt was tied a little too tight, as if he wanted everyone to notice it. His posture had the sharp edges of new confidence, the kind that comes from earning a rank, but not yet earning wisdom. He was my father's favorite student now, a role that seemed to feed his pride as much as the belt around his waist. The light from the overhead fixtures reflected off the polished wood floor, throwing bright streaks across his feet as he moved in small, deliberate circles. Around us, a few other students lingered. Most were lower belts, their white or blue sashes hanging loosely at their waists. They had paused mid-practice to watch what was happening, sensing the shift in the air. Their faces betrayed a mixture of curiosity and unease. Even they seemed to understand that Mason's energy was wrong, that this wasn't a normal training session. He stopped in front of me, leaned on his mop like it was a staff, and grinned. "You're good with languages, right, sis?" His voice dripped with sarcasm. "But this floor doesn't need a dictionary. Maybe you can clean it instead." A few nervous chuckles rippled across the room. One of the white belts looked down at his own shoes, clearly uncomfortable. I could feel the heat of all those eyes on me, waiting to see if I would bite, if I would break character and snap at him. I didn't move. I simply watched him, my breathing slow and steady. Years of discipline had taught me that silence was its own weapon. I had stood in foreign embassies, where an ill-timed word could ignite a crisis, and I had stared down men with guns who wanted nothing more than to see me panic. Compared to that, my brother's mockery was a shallow ripple on a very calm lake. Mason wasn't used to that calm. He thrived on reaction, and without it, he grew restless. He took a step closer, deliberately scuffing his heel on the mat. His friend, the karate black belt who had already puffed up his chest, smirked and shook his head as if to say, "This will be easy." Inside, I cataloged everything: his stance, his balance, the way his ego leaked into every movement. He was a new black belt, proud and loud, but I could see every gap in his armor. He didn't know how much his body was already speaking to me, how every flick of his wrist and shift of his weight translated into a language I understood better than words. My eyes drifted briefly to the corners of the dojo. The mirrors caught our reflections, faceless in the bright light, distorted by the angle. A few students whispered, their voices hushed, but carrying the tone of discomfort. They knew this wasn't training. This was a show, a spectacle, and they were unwilling spectators. Mason twirled the mop once, then let it clatter to the floor. He mimicked a sweeping motion, grinning wider. "Here," he said, "I'll help you get started. After all, someone has to keep the floor clean for real fighters." His words floated in the air, sharp and juvenile, and I felt them land the way a pebble lands in deep water. Small ripples, no real disturbance. I had been mocked by professionals in interrogation rooms, by arrogant officers in polished offices, by strangers who underestimated me because of my calm face and quiet voice. Mason's mockery was a child's game in comparison. I folded my hands loosely in front of me, my voice steady when I finally spoke. "Are you done yet?" The simple question caught him off guard. His grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he forced it back. That half-second was all I needed to confirm what I already knew. His confidence was a mask. Behind him, one of the students coughed softly, the sound awkward and out of place. The air in the dojo felt thick, heavy with expectation. My heartbeat was slow, my mind clear. This was the dip in the rhythm, the low point in the wave where the audience leans in without realizing it, waiting for something to break the tension. I could have ended it there. I could have told him to stop, walked out, and left the lesson unfinished. But I understood the power of letting a moment ripen. My silence was the leash on his pride, and I held it steady. Mason bent down to pick up the mop again, trying to keep the act going. "See, sis? This is more your speed. Languages, cleaning, books. Leave the fighting to people who live in the real world. He didn't know that my real world was made of combat zones and negotiations where one wrong word could end lives. He didn't know that every breath I took on that mat was a decision, a quiet affirmation that I was still in control. I let the quiet stretch again, the hum of the lights filling the space between us. Then I inhaled through my nose, slow and deliberate, and felt the room tilt toward me. Mason could play his part as long as he wanted. I was already writing the next beat of the story, and he had no idea that his stage was about to become his lesson. The first black belt stepped forward with the swagger of someone who had spent too much time being cheered for in his small circle. His black karate gi swayed around his legs, and his grin was wide and taunting. He tilted his head to one side and said, "All right, let's see if the soldier can move like a real fighter." His tone was light, but every syllable carried the weight of someone trying to humiliate me in front of his friends. I did not move. My hands rested loosely by my sides, my feet grounded on the mat, as if they were part of the floor itself. My breathing was slow, even, deliberate. I had been here before, not this dojo, not this exact moment, but in countless other rooms where the air was thick with challenge and the wrong reaction could cost everything. Inside my head, the words I had carried for decades surfaced in a calm, familiar rhythm. 20 years have taught me how to win without taking the first step. He started circling me, his bare feet whispering against the polished wood. He was trying to size me up, to find a crack in the calm he could pry open. I let my gaze follow him lightly, without tension. My body stayed loose, a spring coiled but not stretched. Then he lunged, not a punch, not a kick, just a quick feint of his hand toward my shoulder. He wanted to test me, to see if I would flinch, to get the reaction his ego craved. I shifted my weight an inch, letting his fingertips graze nothing but air, and pivoted slightly on the ball of my back foot. The movement was effortless, a ripple of instinct that felt like water flowing around stone. He stumbled forward a half step, off balance, because he had been expecting resistance that never came. The ripple of laughter he wanted from the other students never arrived. Instead, the room went quiet. He caught himself and scowled, trying to recover his bravado. "Lucky," he muttered under his breath. I tilted my head, my voice low and steady. I spoke in Mandarin, the tone sliding through the air like the whisper of a blade. "Zai jin yibu, ni hui mingbai." Take one more step, and you will understand. He froze, his eyes narrowing. I could see the flicker of doubt ripple through his face. He didn't know what I had said, but the sound of the words carried authority. Language is not always about comprehension. Sometimes, tone alone is enough to strike a nerve. Behind him, I caught sight of Mason watching with a mixture of anticipation and irritation. He wanted the show to continue, to escalate. He thought this was still a game he could control. He didn't understand that the balance of the room had already shifted. The karate black belt shook his shoulders, trying to shrug off the hesitation. He circled again, this time slower, his movements a little less sure. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. He was starting to realize that raw strength and a belt tied around his waist were not enough to bridge the invisible gap between us. I let the silence stretch, because silence can be louder than any taunt. My breathing filled my ears, a metronome that kept me centered. My heart was steady, my mind open but sharp. He lunged again, this time with a palm strike aimed at my chest. I turned my body just enough to let the strike pass harmlessly by, my sleeve brushing his wrist. With a subtle twist of my hip, I guided his momentum past me. His feet faltered again. I could have dropped him to the mat in that instant, but I didn't. Control was the lesson, not humiliation, at least not yet. He stumbled to regain balance, and a faint murmur rippled among the students along the wall. They were starting to see it, the thing Mason refused to see. I was not simply avoiding him. I was teaching him without a word, showing him the gulf between rehearsed confidence and lived experience. I met his eyes briefly and let a faint smile curve my lips. I didn't need to say anything more. He already felt the weight of the unspoken truth pressing on him. In that moment, the room was a held breath, a space balanced perfectly between tension and inevitability. One more step, one more careless move, and he would fall, not because I wanted him to, but because that was where his own arrogance would take him. The karate black belt's jaw tightened, and I could see the frustration building in his shoulders. His movements had shifted from calculated to restless, the subtle tremor of someone who could not stand being underestimated. He glanced at Mason, as if asking silently for permission to escalate. My brother gave him a small nod, a smirk tugging at his lips, still confident that this show would end with me humbled in front of everyone. He lunged without warning this time, his speed impressive for a young fighter, his foot sliding across the polished floor as his fist shot forward in a textbook straight punch. To the untrained eye, it would have looked fast and dangerous. To me, it was an open book. I had been reading these movements for decades. I didn't step back. I didn't even raise my voice. I let my body turn with the flow of his attack, my hip pivoting, my arm moving with quiet precision. His fist met nothing but air as my palm connected lightly with his shoulder, not as a strike, but as a redirection. His own momentum betrayed him, sending his center of gravity forward, while my subtle angle shift cleared his path. He tumbled onto the mat with a loud thud, his body rolling to a stop in stunned silence. I hadn't hit him, I hadn't hurt him. I had simply let his arrogance carry him to the ground. One move, clean, controlled, and undeniable. The dojo fell into an eerie quiet. The sound of his body hitting the mat seemed to echo in that silence, louder than any shout could have been. The other students stopped mid-motion, frozen like statues. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, the air thick with the weight of what they had just seen. My gaze drifted to Mason. His smirk was gone. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to speak but could not find the words. His confidence wavered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. This was the first time, perhaps in his entire adult life, that he had seen me in my element. Not as the quiet sister who read books and spoke languages, but as the soldier and martial artist forged in silence and discipline. The second black belt, Mason's other friend, took an involuntary half-step backward. His hands twitched at his sides, not quite forming fists, and his eyes darted between me and his friend still on the mat. I could see it clearly. Doubt had planted its first seed. He was starting to realize that I wasn't just someone who dabbled in martial arts. He was starting to sense the depth of experience he couldn't see, the years that had taught me control without cruelty. As I stood there, the memory of my old Wing Chun teacher surfaced, unbidden but sharp. I was back in that dusty warehouse in the outskirts of Hong Kong, years ago. The light had filtered through broken windows, catching motes of dust in the air. I could see only his silhouette as he circled me, his voice low but firm in Mandarin. Yong Xin Hu Xi, Yan Jing Bu Yao Dui Quan, Xin Yao Dui Ren. Breathe with intention. Do not let your eyes chase the fist. Let your mind follow the person. I had been younger then, my movements sharper but less efficient. He had tapped my shoulder with a single finger, and I had stumbled off balance, humiliated by how easily he controlled the space around me. Now, standing in Mason's dojo, I felt the echo of that lesson guiding every small adjustment in my posture. My breathing was steady, the same rhythm he had drilled into me for months. My eyes weren't fixed on my opponent's hands or feet. They read his intent before he even moved. The fallen black belt groaned softly, rolling onto his side. He sat up, blinking in disbelief, rubbing the shoulder I had touched as if he expected it to hurt. There was no pain, only the sting of his pride. I did not gloat. I did not move to help him up. I let the moment hang, because sometimes silence delivers the heaviest blow. The second black belt finally spoke, his voice lower than before. What was that? He wasn't asking about the technique. He was asking about me. I met his gaze and said nothing. The room didn't need my words to understand. In that suspended quiet, the air of the dojo had changed. It no longer belonged to Mason or his friends. It belonged to the lesson unfolding in real time, the kind of lesson no one forgets. The kind that starts with a single move and ends with the unspoken understanding that respect cannot be demanded. It has to be earned. I stepped off the mat, my movements calm and deliberate, and reached for my water bottle near the edge of the dojo. My throat wasn't dry, but the simple act of holding the bottle gave my hands something to do while the silence behind me settled like dust after an explosion. The fallen black belt was still sitting on the mat, Mason frozen beside him. The air carried the smell of sweat and the faint tang of polished wood, but under that, I could almost taste the unease. As I bent to grab the bottle, a small clatter drew my eyes to the floor. Mason's phone had slipped out of his dye pocket and skidded to a stop near my foot. The screen lit up with a preview of a text message. I hadn't intended to look, but my years in the military had taught me to read the world as it presents itself, whether I asked for it or not. The message was short, sharp, and cold in its clarity. Make her look weak. Record it. She needs to learn her place. I didn't move for a moment. The words burned themselves into my mind, brighter than the harsh light overhead. My father's name glowed at the top of the screen. My chest rose and fell once, steady and measured, before I turned my gaze back to Mason. He was still watching me, the smirk long gone from his face, his confidence shattered in pieces I could almost see. Inside, I felt no surge of anger, no desire to yell, no spike of heat in my blood. Only the familiar cold of recognition. He still doesn't understand. Every act of betrayal is another lesson I have already passed. The memory of that courthouse returned, vivid as if no time had passed. My father, sitting in a crisp suit, refusing to meet my eyes as his lawyer tried to dismantle my case. His voice back then had the same edge as the text I now read, sharp, dismissive, certain that his authority was unshakable. He believed that legacy was his to give or take, that his daughter was a soldier who could win battles for a flag but not defend her own ground at home. I had proven him wrong with the law. I had walked out of that courtroom with my dignity intact, and the property he thought he could erase from my life returned to me. But victories on paper do not heal the fractures in blood. Mason had stayed with him, learned from him, absorbed the same condescension that dripped from every word of that message. I straightened, the phone still on the floor. I didn't pick it up. I didn't need to. The truth was already carved into my mind, sharp and unmissable. Behind me, the dojo was silent. The other students had gone still, sensing the shift in the air without understanding it. I could hear the faint hum of the lights and the shallow breathing of the boy on the mat. Mason took a half step forward, his eyes darting to his fallen phone. He knew what I had seen. "You can pick it up," I said, my voice low but perfectly clear. He crouched quickly, fingers trembling as he grabbed the phone. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again, but no words came. He had no defense, and I had no interest in hearing one. I took a sip of water, the liquid cool against my tongue, and let the silence stretch. My calmness was deliberate, the same kind I had carried in missions when a single flicker of emotion could compromise everything. When I finally spoke, my words were measured, not cruel. "You didn't need to record anything, Mason. You already got the lesson your friend will never forget." His eyes lowered, shame radiating off him like heat from a dying fire. I felt the weight of the moment settle on him, heavier than any scolding could have been. Inside, a thought crystallized with icy clarity. This was the second betrayal, as sharp as the first, yet dulled by the armor I had forged through years of disappointment. My father's schemes no longer had the power to wound me. They could only remind me of the distance I had already put between his world and mine. I finished the water and capped the bottle. My reflection in the mirror caught my attention for a fleeting moment. Faceless, in shadow, posture unbroken. It reminded me of the nights training alone in quiet warehouses overseas, where discipline was the only companion I could trust. Mason's phone buzzed again in his hand. He flinched, as if the sound itself had weight. I didn't need to see the message. I already knew what kind of man my father was, and nothing he could type would surprise me now. I turned back toward the mat, my voice as calm as ever. "This isn't about making me look weak. It's about you choosing who you want to be when no one else is watching." The room stayed silent, and I let that silence speak for me. Mason's face went pale the instant our eyes met. He had seen me notice the message, and his grip tightened on the phone as if he could erase the truth by holding on to it. The dojo felt colder in that moment, the bright lights above casting long, sharp reflections on the polished wood floor. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. I broke the silence with a voice steady as stone. "You can stop recording, Mason. You've already had enough of a lesson." The words landed heavier than any punch. I watched the shame ripple through him, saw his shoulders stiffen as if he wanted to defend himself but couldn't. For years, he had carried himself like an extension of our father's will, confident that I would always be the outsider, the quiet sister he could dismiss. In a single afternoon, the story he had built around me was cracking apart. Behind him, the second black belt shifted uneasily. He had watched his friend fall with one move, watched the confidence drain from Mason's face, and he was still standing there because pride had pinned him to the spot. His eyes flicked to Mason for guidance, but Mason's face offered none. I set the water bottle down and stepped back onto the mat. My heartbeat was slow, each step deliberate. The second black belt hesitated before raising his guard, a mix of uncertainty and stubbornness in his posture. He was not attacking for himself anymore. He was defending the last shreds of pride in the room. I inhaled through my nose, slow and measured, letting the rhythm of Wing Chun take over. Years of training compressed into muscle memory, calm as a held breath. He lunged with a quick jab, then a clumsy follow-up kick, testing me. I pivoted slightly, letting his energy flow past me, my hands guiding his movements without force. When the opening appeared, I seized it not with violence, but with precision. I stepped in, caught his wrist, and let his momentum carry him forward. My hip turned, my feet rooted into the floor, and with one smooth motion, I guided him to the mat. It was a controlled throw, the kind that left no injury, only the sharp memory of helplessness. He landed with a hollow thud, and the dojo fell silent again. I stood over him, breathing evenly, not triumphant, not cruel, simply present. Slowly, I let my gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of every student who had stopped to watch. Even those who didn't speak Mandarin would understand the meaning of my words, because tone carries its own weight. I spoke, my voice firm but calm, in perfect Mandarin. 真正的咏春不是打败别人，而是控制自己。今天，我控制了自己，也控制了你们。True Wing Chun is not about defeating others. It is about controlling yourself. Today, I controlled myself, and I also controlled you. The syllables cut through the quiet air like a blade. A few students blinked, clearly not understanding the words but feeling the weight of them anyway. The two black belts on the floor understood in their own way. Mason understood most of all. I turned back to him, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the lesson to settle in. You wanted me to look weak, I said finally, my tone level. But weakness isn't about falling down. It's about giving away your integrity before the fight even starts. His eyes dropped to the floor. His hands trembled slightly around the phone he still hadn't put away. For the first time that afternoon, he seemed smaller than his black belt, smaller than the room he thought he controlled. I glanced at the two black belts still catching their breath on the mat. They weren't enemies, they were mirrors reflecting choices I had already outgrown. A part of me wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was the quiet certainty that the cycle had ended. My mind flicked briefly to my father, the man behind the text, the architect of this little humiliation he had hoped to stage. I imagined his expression if he could see what had happened here, not rage, not disappointment, but the cold calculation of someone who realized his influence was slipping. I knew then, with absolute clarity, that his power over me had ended long before this day. I took one last steady breath, my pulse unshaken. The mat beneath my feet felt like an extension of the calm I had carried from distant battlefields to this small family arena. I had not raised my voice. I had not thrown a single strike in anger. And yet, the entire room now belonged to me, not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it in silence. When I stepped off the mat again, the sound of my footsteps was the only noise in the room. The dojo remained silent for several heartbeats after I stepped off the mat, but the silence didn't last long. A low murmur began to ripple through the room, growing into a nervous chorus of whispers. I could feel the eyes of the students following me, not with defiance anymore, but with a mixture of awe and unease. A few of them still clutched their phones, the tiny lenses gleaming as they tried to capture what had just happened. The first voice broke through the tension, a young student near the mirrors whispering to his friend. She didn't even touch him hard, he just fell. Another replied, "Did you see her throw the second one? It was like he was weightless." The whispers built on each other until the room buzzed with speculation, disbelief, and a quiet thrill. I noticed 2 phones still raised at chest height, recording. Neither student was bold enough to hold the device openly, but I had spent too many years in rooms where surveillance could cost lives. I always knew when I was being watched. My eyes flicked to Mason. He followed my gaze and, for the first time that afternoon, realized what he had unleashed. I didn't tell them to stop filming. It didn't matter anymore. Whatever they caught would live beyond these walls. And I had already accepted the lesson this day was meant to teach. Not to me, but to everyone else. By that evening, I was back in my apartment on base, the faint hum of the heater filling the quiet. I set my boots neatly by the door, hung my uniform jacket on the rack, and poured myself a glass of water. My phone vibrated on the counter. I ignored it at first, but the buzzing continued until curiosity won. It was a message from a fellow officer. "Grant, is this you?" Attached was a link. I opened it, and the familiar walls of Mason's dojo filled the screen. The footage was shaky, taken from the corner by the mirrors, but the story was clear. Mason's voice carried, laughing. My stillness. The first black belt lunging and falling in a single fluid motion. The second throw, just as controlled. And then, my words in Mandarin ringing through the room. 真正的咏春不是打败别人，而是控制自己。今天，我控制了自己，也控制了你们。True Wing Chun is not about defeating others, it is about controlling yourself. Today, I controlled myself, and I also controlled you. Even without subtitles, the internet didn't need to understand the words to feel the weight. I scrolled down to the comments. That black belt tried to humiliate her and got folded like a chair. Who is this woman? She moves like water. Respect. Mason is a joke. He set this up and it backfired so hard. The videos multiplied overnight. People clipped the Mandarin phrase and turned it into a loop, pairing it with captions like, "Discipline has no language barrier." One comment stood out with hundreds of likes. Her father told him to record it. The text message is in the screenshots. Imagine your own parent plotting to humiliate you and you still walk out like that. That's power. I froze at that line. Screenshots of Mason's phone had leaked. His trembling hands must have given someone an angle they couldn't resist capturing. My father's words were out in the open now. Make her look weak. Record it. She needs to learn her place. The internet devoured the betrayal. Some condemned Mason. Others turned their anger on my father, calling him a coward who tried to break his own daughter. The story spread beyond martial arts forums into broader social media spaces. Commentators dissected it as a lesson in pride, family, and the quiet strength of self-control. I didn't reply to my officer friend. I didn't explain. I placed the phone face down on the counter and leaned against the cool wall, letting the soft hum of the heater and the distant sounds of base life steady my thoughts. Inside, I felt no joy in their humiliation. I felt no spike of victory from the viral attention. What settled over me instead was the same quiet that had carried me through the dojo, a clarity born from letting my actions speak without anger. This was justice of a different kind. No courtroom, no formal reprimands, no raised voices or family confrontations. The world had witnessed the truth, unedited, and weighed it on its own. Mason had wanted to record my weakness. Instead, the recording became a mirror for his own. My father's words had been turned inside out, exposing the pettiness he believed would stay in the shadows. I poured another glass of water and sipped slowly. The reflection in the window showed a woman standing tall, posture straight, face calm. I thought about all the battles I had fought with strategy and law, about the times I had chosen silence over spectacle. This moment was proof of what I had always believed. Justice does not always come in courtrooms. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through the eyes of those who finally see the truth. I exhaled and whispered to myself, more as a reminder than a celebration. This is the new kind of justice. It doesn't need a gavel. It doesn't need a shout. It simply exists when truth speaks for itself. It was 2 days after the video had exploded online when I heard the knock on my apartment door. The sound was soft at first, hesitant, and then repeated with a faint urgency. I already knew who it was before I opened it. When I swung the door open, Mason stood there with his hood pulled up over his head, his shoulders hunched against the evening wind. His eyes were bloodshot, his lips dry, and his hands were buried in the pocket of his sweatshirt. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, stripped of the bravado that had filled that dojo. His voice cracked. I was wrong. I shouldn't have done any of it. Dad said. I raised a hand, cutting him off before the excuse could find its footing. My voice was calm and even. No one forced you to humiliate me, Mason. No one made you laugh or mock or try to turn me into a joke. You chose that. He froze, the weight of my words settling on him heavier than any rebuke could have. His mouth opened, then closed, and his gaze dropped to the floor like he couldn't bear to hold my eyes. For the first time in years, he looked like the younger brother I used to protect from bullies at school. Only this time he had become the bully, and the world had witnessed it. I stepped back and gestured for him to come inside. He hesitated before shuffling past me, his sneakers squeaking softly on the polished floor. He sat down at the edge of my small dining table, his hands twisting together nervously. I didn't rush to fill the silence. I had learned long ago that letting a pause stretch could be more powerful than any lecture. I didn't think it would go like that, he said finally, his voice quiet. Dad said, if I made you look weak, maybe it would, I don't know, put things back the way they were. He said you've always acted like you're better than us. The words might have stung once, but not anymore. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed, my voice steady. I don't act like I'm better, Mason. I've just lived differently. I've been to places that changed me. I don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore, but you and Dad, you wanted a show, and you got one. He winced, pressing a hand to his forehead. I lost everything. My students. They won't even look at me. People online. They're calling me a bully, a fake. And Dad? He stopped, his jaw trembling. He won't even answer my calls now. I let his words settle. The rhythm of the moment was the downward slope of the sine wave, the calm after the emotional storm. I wasn't here to gloat or to reopen wounds. I wanted him to feel the stillness that comes after the noise fades, the place where truth lives without embellishment. I warned you without saying a word that day, I said. When you laughed at me, when you tried to make me small, I didn't fight back with anger. I just showed you who I am. He nodded slowly, shame radiating off him. His fingers drummed lightly on the table, restless. I don't know how to fix this, he admitted. I can't take the video back. I can't erase what Dad said or what I did. I walked over to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. The base was quiet at this hour, a few security lights casting long pools of amber on the ground. My reflection in the glass was still and faceless in the shadow, a reminder of the calm I had fought to earn over years of discipline and disappointment. You can't erase it, I said, still looking outside. But you can decide what you do from here. You can live in that shame, or you can learn from it. Real strength isn't in the belt around your waist, Mason. It's in the choices you make when no one is watching. He sniffled softly, and I heard the faint scrape of the chair as he stood. I want to make it right. I don't know how, but I'll try. I finally turned back to face him. Then start with yourself. Start by being the man you wanted to pretend to be in that dojo. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a pause between chapters, a soft exhale before the world moved forward. Mason nodded, his shoulders slumping as if he had set down a weight he had carried too long. When he left, the apartment felt still, but not empty. I took a slow breath, the same kind I had taken before every spar, every mission, every moment that demanded clarity. This was the quiet before the next turn in the wave. The low point that would lead to the redemption neither of us had seen coming yet. A week after Mason came to my apartment, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. It was plain, with no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. My father's script was sharp, deliberate, like the man himself. I held the envelope for a long moment before opening it, the paper cool against my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded in half, 4 words written with the weight of a lifetime behind them. I underestimated you. I was wrong. No excuses, no elaborate explanations. Just a confession, small but heavy. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in my hand. and for a moment the room dissolved around me. I was back in that courthouse 5 years ago, the fluorescent lights buzzing above my head. My father had sat on the other side of the room, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. He had avoided looking at me until the very end, when the judge forced him to sign the papers returning what he had taken. I could still see the way his hand hovered over the document, his pen pausing for just a fraction of a second. His eyes had met mine then, and for the briefest moment, I saw a flicker of something he would never say aloud. Maybe regret, maybe pride, buried under pride. Then it was gone, replaced by the steel mask he wore to face the world. The memory washed over me like a slow tide. Back then, I had walked out of the courthouse with a legal victory, but an empty heart. I had thought that nothing would ever mend the fracture in our family, that my father would die with his stubbornness intact. Now, sitting in my small apartment with his words in my hand, I felt the first crack of something softer. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the quiet release of a weight I hadn't realized I was still carrying. I inhaled deeply through my nose, slow and deliberate. The sound of my own breathing filled the room, steady and measured, the same way it had been on the dojo mat, the same way it had been in dark corners of the world where silence meant survival. That breath was a motif in my life, a thread tying together battles fought in courtrooms, in combat, and in my own heart. I placed the letter flat on the table and closed my eyes. The anger I had once carried for him felt distant now, like a storm that had moved over the horizon. He had tried to break me, then humiliate me, and in the end, he had written the only sentence that truly mattered. When I opened my eyes again, the kitchen felt brighter, not because of the light, but because the shadows of resentment had thinned. The letter didn't erase the past, but it acknowledged it. It said enough. I folded the paper carefully, slid it back into the envelope, and set it in a drawer. My breathing slowed, and with it, the last edge of bitterness in my chest began to settle. For the first time in years, I felt the quiet space where anger had lived begin to empty. A few evenings later, Mason returned. This time, he knocked only once and stepped back, waiting. His hood was down, and he met my eyes without flinching. There was no bravado left in him, only a quiet resolve. "Can you teach me?" he asked. His voice was steady but soft. Not just the fighting, the everything, the control, the calm, the languages, all of it. I studied him for a long moment. His shoulders were squared, but not tense. His eyes were clear. He wasn't looking for a shortcut to reclaim pride. He was asking for a chance to rebuild himself from the inside out. I gestured for him to come in, and we sat at the same small table where I had read our father's letter. "If I teach you," I said, "you have to understand something. We don't learn this to show off. We don't learn it to humiliate anyone. We learn it so that we never have to prove ourselves to anyone again." He nodded quickly. "I understand." I stood and led him to the open space in my living room, where the evening light stretched long across the floor. "Show me your stance," I said. He obeyed, clumsy but sincere. His knees bent too much, his shoulders rose too high, and his fists trembled with tension. I walked around him, gently adjusting his elbows, pressing his shoulders down, guiding his center lower. "Again," I said. "Breathe." He inhaled, shaky at first, then steadier. "This," I continued, "is where it begins. Before punches, before kicks, before any of the things you wanted to show off in that dojo, it begins with this, with balance, with breath, with knowing yourself so deeply that no one can shake it." He nodded, sweat already gathering at his temples from the effort of stillness. "And the languages?" he asked quietly. I smiled faintly. "They're the same lesson, just in words instead of movement. Listening before speaking, understanding before reacting, strength without noise." We practiced for an hour in silence, the rhythm of our breathing the only sound in the room. When we paused, I spoke softly, in the language that had carried me through so many chapters of my life. "Zhenzheng de Liliang, Buyong Zhengming." He blinked. "What does that mean?" "True strength does not need to be proven," I translated. The words hung in the air, gentle but immovable. Mason repeated them under his breath, stumbling over the tones but catching the meaning. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen in years, respect without envy, and the quiet spark of a brother who wanted to rise, not to conquer. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a stillness settle over us both. The long wave of conflict had finally crested and fallen into quiet water. I had lived long enough to know that not every story of betrayal ends with reconciliation, but this one, at least, had found its way towards something better than anger: understanding. I took one more deep, measured breath and exhaled slowly. The air felt lighter in my chest, carrying with it the last remnants of bitterness. For the first time, the silence between Mason and me was not heavy. It was a bridge. The dojo felt different at night. The overhead lights were softer, and the hum of the outside world faded into a kind of hush that reminded me of distant deployment nights, when only the rhythm of my breathing kept me company. I had opened a small evening class for a handful of students who wanted something more than belts and trophies. They came for discipline, for stillness, and for the quiet strength that didn't need to shout to be real. I stood at the front of the mat, my bare feet grounded, my arms resting lightly at my sides. "Tonight," I said, my voice low but clear, "we will practice Wing Chun with breathing. Every strike begins with a breath. Every defense begins with awareness." The students followed my movements, mimicking the slow shift of weight from heel to toe, the soft pivot of hips that rooted us into the floor. I watched them inhale and exhale, the sound filling the quiet room like a whispering tide. Among them, in the back row, was Mason. He had been coming for 3 weeks now, always standing a little behind the others, never asking for attention. His movements were still stiff, but the fire in his eyes had changed. It was no longer the fire of ego. It was the steady flame of someone who wanted to learn, truly learn. I walked past him as we moved through the next exercise. "Breathe," I said softly. "Slow. Feel the air move through you before you move your body." He nodded, inhaled, and as he exhaled, he whispered in halting Mandarin, "Zhenzheng de Liliang, Buyong Zhengming." True strength does not need to be proven. The words were imperfect, but they carried weight. He repeated them again, this time smoother, and I felt something shift inside me. His eyes met mine briefly, and in that glance, I saw the boy he had been and the man he was trying to become. We finished the exercise and sat cross-legged for a few minutes of meditation. The room was silent except for the sound of our breathing. In that stillness, I realized that forgiveness was the greatest legacy I could leave in this family. Not medals, not property, not viral videos or courtroom victories. Forgiveness was the inheritance that could break a cycle of bitterness before it consumed us all. I closed my eyes and inhaled slowly. The air felt clean, light, and full of possibility. In that moment, the weight of the past years, the courthouse, the betrayal, the staged humiliation, felt like it had finally settled into the soil of memory, ready to grow into something new. When we finished, I bowed to the class, and they bowed back. Mason lingered as the others left, helping me roll up the mats. He didn't speak much, but he didn't need to. Every movement of his hands, every quiet step he took beside me, said more than apologies ever could. 2 weeks later, my phone buzzed on the low table in my living room as the sun began to set. The light outside poured through the window in streaks of deep gold, catching the edges of the glass and painting my walls in amber. I picked up the phone, expecting another reminder from the base or a message from Mason. Instead, it was from my father. "I'm watching, proud in silence." 7 words. They sat on the screen like a stone dropped in still water. I stared at them for a long time, my thumb hovering over the glass, my mind drifting back through the years. I remembered the courthouse again, the sharp smell of paper and ink, the weight of his refusal to meet my gaze. I remembered the text message he had sent Mason, cruel and calculated. And now, this, an acknowledgement, not shouted, not defended, but offered quietly, as if he finally understood that words whispered in sincerity could travel further than words shouted in anger. I folded the phone gently in my hand and turned toward the window. The sky was awash with color, streaks of pink and orange sliding into deepening blue. I felt the quiet pulse of my own breath, slow and deliberate, filling my chest with air that carried no bitterness. Justice does not need to be loud. It does not need to announce itself with gavel strikes or public applause. Justice lives in the quiet, in the spaces where we stand tall and refuse to be moved by the weight of others' cruelty. I thought about Mason, about the way his voice had trembled the first night he tried to repeat my Mandarin words. I thought about my father, somewhere on the other side of that message, perhaps sitting in his chair, phone in hand, finally seeing me for who I was, not who he wanted me to be. My reflection in the glass was faceless in the fading light, but my posture was straight, my shoulders relaxed. I whispered to myself, a thought as simple as it was true. Justice doesn't need noise, it only needs me to keep standing. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow that seemed to settle in my chest. I exhaled slowly, the breath carrying with it the last thread of tension I had held for years. In that quiet, I knew the wave had finally come to rest. I have spent my life learning that true victories rarely come with cheers. They arrive in the quiet, in moments when no one else is watching, in the spaces where you breathe and realize you've stood your ground without raising your voice. I didn't need a medal for what happened in that dojo. I didn't need the world to know that my father had tried to humiliate me, or that my brother had become his accomplice. I didn't need the video to go viral or for strangers online to call me strong. Because real justice, the kind that stays with you, doesn't shout. It whispers. I think about that day often, the light on the polished wooden floor, the soft scuff of bare feet, the sting of betrayal in my chest that didn't turn into anger. I remember the first black belt lunging at me, the second falling with nothing more than a guided motion. One move each, controlled, precise, unshaken. That was all it took. It wasn't about winning a fight. It was about proving, mostly to myself, that I had already won the larger battle years ago. I had walked away from the courthouse with my head high after my father tried to strip me of what was mine. I had walked into battlefields, negotiation rooms, and the quiet edges of the world carrying only the armor of self-control, and 10 languages that could open doors guns could not. And when the moment came, when the people who should have loved me tried to make me small, I met them with stillness, with breath, with one move. Mason trains with me now. In the evenings, our apartment turns into a quiet dojo of its own, the soft slap of feet against the floor and the low hum of breathing exercises filling the air. He has learned to bow to the mat before he steps onto it, not for me, but for the discipline he once thought he could fake. Sometimes he repeats the Mandarin phrase in a low whisper, still tripping over the tones. Zhenzhen de li liang, buyong zhengming. True strength does not need to be proven. I smile every time he says it, not because it is perfect, but because he finally understands. My father never called me after his last text. He didn't need to. I'm watching, proud in silence. 7 words that closed a chapter years in the making. That message was more than pride. It was surrender and a quiet apology folded into the space between syllables. I no longer carry the weight of anger toward him. Some things, once released, do not return. Life feels different now, not louder, not more triumphant, just lighter. I have students who come to me for more than self-defense. They come to learn the art of standing without aggression, of moving without fear. They learn the rhythm of controlled breath, the language of balance, the quiet conversation between the body and the mind. In that small studio, I see versions of myself. The girl who once tried to prove herself to everyone, the soldier who thought victory lived only in the visible, and the woman who now knows that peace and strength are the same thing when you choose them every day. I don't know if the world will remember my story. Maybe the video will fade into the endless sea of content, replaced by the next spectacle. But I will remember the faces in that dojo, the moment the laughter froze, the way the air turned still enough to hear my own breath. That was the moment I understood the circle of my life had closed. No need for titles, no need for loud revenge. Justice arrived in the silence of one move and the truth of 10 languages. I step onto the mat alone some nights, close my eyes, and inhale deeply. The motif of slow, steady breath that has followed me through war zones, courtrooms, and family fractures fills my lungs again. And as I exhale, I feel the last threads of the past loosen completely. Sometimes the world doesn't need to see you swing to know you are unshakable. Sometimes one move and a calm smile is enough to silence the world. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.